Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. It is relatively easy to explain the Tories' spectacular victory in the general election. For the elites, it was about Jeremy Corbyn. But for the voters, it was all about Brexit. Indeed, it was Brexit 2.0. For Bojo, it is time to deliver. And Mr. Lavrov goes to Washington. Cross-talking some real news, I'm joined by my guest, Glenn Deason. He is a professor at the Higher School of Economics, as well as author of The Decay of Western Civilization and Resurgence of Russia. We also have Dimitri Babich. He's a political analyst and editor at InnosMe Internet Media Project. And in London, we cross Alexander Mercouris. He's a writer on legal affairs, as well as editor-in-chief of theduran.com. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Let's go to London. Alexander, the dust is settling, okay, about this general election. The blowout of Labour is spectacular. We have to go all the way back to 1935. I suppose the civil war within the Labour Party has already started, and now we have a majority for the Tories, something we haven't seen since Margaret Thatcher. What does this tell us about the electorate? Because a week ago, if you were to tell me working class people that have never voted Tory ever in their whole life, or millennials voting for the first time, they all voted, or many of them, majority of them, voted Tory. What is going on? This is an earthquake in British politics.
It is an earthquake in British politics, but it is essential to qualify it. I've seen many places this claim about Labour having its worst result since 1935. This is highly misleading.
Okay.
If you look at the percentage of the vote, Labour got around 32%. That is more than it got in 2015 and 2010 and in 1987 and in 1992. It simply looks at the number of MPs that he got in the House of Commons, and that is a reflection of our rather strange electoral system and the fact that Labour in 2015 lost around 50 MPs.
Okay, but Alexander, okay, good. That's why we have this program here. I agree with you. Nonetheless, my friend, this is a humiliation. And again, you know, having so many parts of the country traditionally going Labour went to the other side. That is something quite spectacular.
Absolutely. And this is the key point to understand, because what has happened is that Labour has lost ground heavily in its working class, Northern English, Midlands, heartlands, whereas it has held on surprisingly well in the sort of southern, middle class, affluent consumer belts, which it won over in the 1990s under Tony Blair. And the reason is Brexit. I mean, I've seen endless explanations, arguments about this. There is no question at all about this. Working class England has never liked the EU. They voted against it when Britain joined in 1975 in the referendum then. They've been consistently hostile. They made absolutely clear that they were hostile in the 2016 referendum when they voted heavily against it. And they felt bitterly angry and very betrayed by their party, the Labour Party, which went into this election taking what was in effect a Remain position. We can analyse that in more detail. And it's seemingly prioritising Southern English middle-class voters over them.
This begs a question, Glenn. This begs the question, is the Labour Party representative of working people? Because it seems to me what's happening, we'll talk about it in the second half of the program, is that the Labour Party, the perception many people have of the Labour Party is it is for affluent people, for professional people from the southern part of the country. I mean, in a remarkable way, the Tories are taking the mantle of the middle class, which is remarkable, because that has not been the perception of the Tories through time. Go ahead.
No, and that's also because Brexit, well, the EU was often seen as serving the elites by being a bit of a globalist project, if you want, while the opening of borders, both for wages and for the demographic shifts, was often seen as putting more pressure, downward pressure on the salaries of the working class. So obviously, this put also Corbyn in a difficult position because from his ideological perspective, looking after the working man, he had taken a position a bit more harsh and critical of the European Union. So, but representing Labour, he obviously had to switch his position a bit. And but
that really kind of begs the question because, I think that's one of the, and I think Jeremy Corbyn's a very good person, don't get me wrong here, but and let me switch this to Dima here. I mean, he never really made it clear how he felt about Brexit. He had one leg in one camp and another camp. And I mean, it was very, and I think that's part of the messaging problem that Labour had. And of course, the focus on Corbyn as a person, which the mainstream media vilified. Go ahead.
Well, I think Corbyn just wasn't consistent,
Yeah.
So the Labour lost the voters who supported it while being pro-Brexit. There was some substantial part of Labour voters like that, at the last election. And they didn't gain the new ones, because he was inconsistent. If, Mr. Corbyn, if you are against, what Israel is doing to Palestinians, you should be against other Western, adventures, basically military adventures, against what they're doing in Syria, against what they're doing in Ukraine. He failed to do it. And it's interesting, I think I know why so many people finally supported Brexit. Actually, this is another referendum on Brexit, and the English people again
and that's why we're calling this program Brexit 2.0.
I
Exactly.
understand why they have that feeling, because a lot of Europeans have a feeling that whatever they decide, whatever they vote, things will go on as they did. The EU will have its way. They rejected the European Constitution. They had the Lisbon Treaty. They basically tried to oust the politicians which put Europe on confrontation course with Russia. Other politicians like that were installed in place. And the reaction of the press, both in the United States and in Britain, the reaction of the globalist press, they don't understand anything. The Guardian says Boris Johnson just threw out the most talented liberal members of his government. Whom? Gavin Williamson, who said that Russian military ships entered the North Sea for exercises. That is an act of aggression against Britain.
Good riddance. Go ahead. Jumping in.
Yeah, no, I would just like to add, if this was a referendum on the European Union, I guess the best example of how lost Labour was on its official position on Brexit, which was they would first go back to the EU and then honestly negotiate the best possible deal they could for another Brexit, and then they would put it to a referendum in which they would argue against the deal they passed and instead call for staying in the EU. I mean, this is ridiculous.
Let's let Alex jump in here in London. Glenn just put it perfectly, okay? That was the perfect description here, okay? Wanting it both ways all the time, okay? Go ahead, jump in, Alex.
It's exactly correct. And this is where we have to look at what has been happening to the Labour Party over the period of its existence. In the early 1980s, 80% of people who voted Labour were working class manual labourers, working people. Today, that percentage has fallen to 40%. That was even before this last election, where it'll have fallen even more. It has become a middle-class liberal party. Middle-class liberal people like the EU. Working-class people in Britain don't. What happened in this election is that Corbyn, who has been trying to reach out again towards the working-class Labour base that was already eroding away, found himself boxed in by a party whose leadership, whose parliamentary representation, and whose membership is overwhelmingly middle class and pro-EU and pro-Remain. So he was stuck with this impossible policy, which Glenn Deason has described very well, which is, of course, a Remain policy. It was intended to keep Britain in the EU. And, of course, working-class voters saw right through that. That made them very sceptical, not just about Corbyn himself. He was always being referred to as a weak leader and an indecisive and, frankly, no longer a straight, honest leader, which is how he'd been perceived before, but it also made them very skeptical about his entire left-wing program.
You know, Dima, during this whole almost 3-year process here, we've done multiple programs on it, and I've always pointed out that both parties suffered through it. But with this election, it's the Tories that capitalized on the indecision of the Labour Party, and now the civil war within the Labour Party, it goes on full blast as we speak. Go ahead.
Absolutely. But, you know, I have nothing against middle-class liberal people, okay? You know, but the reaction of the globalist press, you know, the Wall Street Journal, why should Britain stay in the EU?
I'm waiting for this. Go ahead.
Because if Britain leaves the EU, then there is a fear of sclerosis as Russia, China pose unprecedented economic and political challenges to the EU, which is now maybe weakened by the UK's departure. Which challenges, you know?
Where's the sclerosis come from? It's from within.
Absolutely. Okay? And first, the sclerosis came from these wonderful, talented Liberal members whom Boris Johnson threw out. And second, what is the threat from China? Does China want to invade Europe, you know? No, they're providing cheap goods, you know, they're providing cheap labor. Did Russia make any threatening moves? Well, Russia craves to have good relations with Europe. Russia has done everything possible. We made all of these huge concessions in the end of the 80s, in the 90s, you know, taking all the troops
What did
back
they
to
get
Russia.
for it?
And we didn't get anything for it. And now they write that Britain should stay because we are a threat.
Okay. 25 seconds. Go ahead.
You know, lost my thread here. No, I was just going to say that this need to clean up this possible civil war in the Labour Party. Sorry, I think that's very similar to what they need in America. But instead of doing cleanup there, they just look towards a Russian conspiracy. I think what you're going to see here in Labour now, they're going to explain it as, it was Corbyn. He's a communist, anti-Semite. He hates Britain, and he's leading a cult instead of actually addressing.
Well, Glenn, you
problem.
just introduced the second half of the program because that's what we're going to talk about. I want to thank Alexander McCurris for joining us. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on some real news. Stay with RT.
I had a spiritual experience, and I had the little girl that died in the fire, Cynthia Collins.
Is anybody there?
So who's that?
We're looking for Kenny Ritchie.
I'm 54 years old. I spent 21 and a half years on death row in Ohio for a crime I didn't commit.
I always knew that he was innocent because I read the papers, but nobody would listen. And
trial was pretty much a farce. They already had him guilty even before that trial.
no, you fooled nobody. Not me, not that baby, not any of these people. You will burn in hell.
I think that Kenny hasn't forgiven himself for something.
I knew she was there, and I knew exactly what I was doing.
People lie. And sometimes there's no explanation.
During the Great Depression, which I'm old enough to remember, there was, and most of my family were unemployed, working class. There wasn't, it was bad, much worse subjectively than today, but there was an expectation that things were going to get better. There was a real sense of hopefulness. There isn't today.
Today's America was shaped by the 10 principles of concentration of wealth and power. Reduce democracy, attack solidarity, engineer elections, manufacture consent, and other principles, according to Noam Chomsky.
One set of rules for the rich, opposite set of rules for the poor. That's what happens when you put power into the hands of a narrow sector of wealth, which is dedicated to increasing power for itself, just as you'd expect.
One of the most influential intellectuals of our time speaks about the modern civilization of America.
In the troubled 1970s, a group of killers rampaged through parts of Northern Ireland.
There was coordinated loyalist attacks, particularly on the Catholic population in Belfast. Tens of thousands were forced to flee their homes. And what was striking about these attacks was that the RUC, the police, actually took part in the attacks. So instead of preventing them, they were active participants in the burning of whole streets in Belfast at that time.
More than 100 innocent civilians were murdered.
As the review continued and we found out more, I was surprised about the extent and the degree to which the collusion was involved in some of those cases.
The killers would later be named the Glenanne Gang.
I think it went to the very, very top. I think it even crossed the water where politicians knew what was going on and gave the go-ahead.
Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter LaBelle. To remind you, we're discussing some real news. And now to London, where we're joined by Marcus Papadopoulos. He's the editor of Politics First magazine. Marcus, thank you for joining us today. In the first part of the program, we were talking about the outcome of the British general election for the UK. And now I'd like to kind of extrapolate outward to other parts of the world, to the United States and to Europe. You know, when Brexit in 2016, it was easy for a lot of people to say, in the elites and all the smart people to look down on us. That's just a one-off, okay? Then Donald Trump, well, that's just a one-off. And then we have this election. It's not a one-off. What trend, if you had a broad brush, would you say is unfolding before us right now? Go ahead, Marcus.
Well, I should first of all say, Peter, Jeremy Corbyn, I submit to you, offered real change for Britain, from renationalising the railways to renationalising energy to ensuring that Britain would no longer participate in American-led wars of intervention. However, Mr. Corbyn made a catastrophic strategic mistake by performing a U-turn on Brexit, because by having performed a U-turn on Brexit, it meant that he lost the Labour heartlands. And without the Labour heartlands, the Midlands of England, the north of England, no Labour leader, Peter, can ever hope to win a general election. So it's not so much the Conservatives who won this election, it's Labour who lost it.
That's a fair characterization.
And now what can we say about that? Well, the lesson to be learnt is respect the will of the public. You do not do what Mr. Corbyn did to appease the Parliamentary Labour Party, i.e. Labour MPs who are Blairites or Brownites. You listen to the public. If we have a look at Donald Trump in 2016, he listened to the concerns, legitimate concerns of the working class in America, the blue-collar workers. And in turn, they voted for him. And that was a very important factor in Mr. Trump's victory. But if we turn to Jeremy Corbyn, even though Mr. Corbyn is personally opposed to the European Union, he bitterly dislikes the European Union, he did not listen to the will of the British public. And that is what brought about a catastrophic defeat. And finally, Peter, this is incredible. Mr. Corbyn went after the migrant vote at the expense of the Labour heartlands. That is not just political suicide. That was idiocy on a scale that I personally have never witnessed before in UK politics. So the moral of the story is this: listen to the voice of the public, be it the American public or the British.
And don't listen to the elites here. Okay, Glenn, again, going into this general election, if you look at the polls, I mean, this is what we do for a living, okay? We're political talking heads here, so we have to look at the polls. The polls were grossly wrong again. Now, this is a built-in bias. We see it time and time again, where this built-in bias from the elites they want to put their thumb on the scale. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn, the way he was treated, I think he had a very muddled presentation. I think he hurt himself. I think he hurt the party really bad. But as a person, I think he's a wonderful person here. But you could see that the media was putting its thumb on the scale against him. Now, it doesn't always work out the same way. The media hates Trump, and the more they hate him, it seems the more his popularity grows here. The role of the elites here.
Well, I think the polling, by the way, I think it serves two purposes. One is to measure, of course, what the people think, but also it's intended to influence people. So I learned to be a bit more skeptical, at least over the last few years. But I also think that what the commonality across the board is this idea that people are more or less, the polls that are consistent is people want change. They want a break with the status quo. And for that reason, that kind of determined the election in the US as well as Britain. And I think that what's unfortunate for Corbyn is that he, as Marcus pointed out correctly, I think he did offer real change. And moreover, he's been very consistent. He's been saying the same thing since the 1980s. So there was a lot of trust to him. And I think, the fact that he was able to go against the elites and still the people liked him, I think that was, that was what was his strength. But this Brexit thing, obviously, it didn't get, it got to him because now he turned on all of his key points. So
Dima, how is in this impending Brexit, because Boris Johnson does have a majority, he will get his plan through Parliament. What is the message from the European Union? Because over this entire process, as they did this ridiculous waltz with Theresa May, where they got the better of her, this is going to be very different now. What is the message that the European Union takes from this victory from Boris Johnson?
The European Union already said, I'm quoting the Wall Street Journal here, they said that they are afraid that a less regulated UK could pose a competitive threat to them. So that means they will insist that the UK broadly conforms to EU's environmental, labour and other standards. Which means that basically it didn't make sense
so it means,
leave.
Okay, we go to Marcus. That means leave the European Union, but mimic us anyway, okay? I mean, again, these elites don't get the message, okay? Because they're looking after elite interests and not the average voter. How many more elections and referenda do we have to go through before they wake up and understand that? Go ahead, Marcus.
Well, the European Union did not ever show any respect to the will of the British public when the ordinary British man and woman voted in June 2016 to leave the European Union. And there's no surprise, but one thing is for certain, Peter, that with Boris Johnson's massive victory in the general election, that Brexit will be delivered. The UK will leave the European Union by the 31st of January 2020. And, political parties in Britain should learn from the arrogance and contempt that the European Union has shown to the British public.
Yeah.
And I would single out the Liberal Democrat Party, because the Liberal Democrat Party went into the election, Peter, not saying that they want a second referendum, but they were saying in their manifesto that they want to revoke Article 50. That's neither liberal nor democratic.
Exactly. All right, gentlemen. I want to change gears here. We have, of course, the impeachment process is going forward in the United States against Donald Trump, and guess who shows up in the Oval Office, Dima? Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and a storm. I can't preface that word storm, but a storm in the media as a result here. What's this all about?
Well, it's just incredible. The American Thinker, an American publication, and our friend Paul Robinson, in his blog, Irrationality, they were just surprised, to say the least, by the reaction from the so-called liberals. Let me just quote, Anne Applebaum.
Our favorite.
Apart from anything else, presidents don't usually meet with foreign ministers. Why is this unusual honor being bestowed on this one? Well, go to the blogger Rationality and see the pictures. Obama meeting Lavrov, Putin meeting Pompeo, and John Bolton, and many others.
Okay, let me give it.
So hostile,
and let me give a quote. Let me give a quote from the Washington Post. Quote: Trump's welcoming Russia's top diplomat to the Oval Office is one of his most brazen moves yet.
Absolutely.
Brazen?
Well, I think this is in broader spectrum, this is very much an ongoing process which is intensified, which is criminalizing diplomacy. Again, diplomacy is supposed to be defined as the art and the practice of negotiating with and engaging with foreign powers, but
including unpleasant people.
Yes, well, it's not just allies; it's also your adversaries. But I think especially after the Cold War, this idea that you shouldn't talk to your adversaries, in other words, you only meet with your friends, this has taken more and more strength, and it's very much based on this idea that meeting with someone is a reward which will be exploited.
Legitimizes them.
And this is, of course, very dangerous now for relations with Russia, because kind of the common position everyone needs to fall into if they want to have any political legitimacy is you have to go as hard against Russia as possible. So
even if it's against your interests. Okay, let me go back to Marcus in London. One of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this, well, first of all, the media just gets its hair on fire, which is kind of fun to watch, but I mean, doesn't move the needle in the right direction here. But you have this resistance movement that will not let up on Trump when it comes to Russia. When it's his administration that has imposed more sanctions and whatnot than Obama ever did. But the juxtaposition is very important as you have people like Macron in France that actually are saying it's about time to start moving forward with a Western relationship with Russia. This is really just turned into a logjam, okay, because the Americans are so obsessed, or I should say American elites are. Go ahead, Marcus.
Peter, I couldn't care less how American media are covering Sergei Lavrov's visit to America. All that matters is that no matter how dire the relationship is between America and Russia, and it really is dire, it is essential for the world that there is some form of dialogue between Washington and Moscow. Even at the height of the Cold War, Russia's greatest ever diplomat, Andrei Gromyko, regularly visited America. That is something to be applauded. There must be dialogue today between Russia and America. But there's a problem, Peter. The Russians have three legitimate demands of the Americans, and the Americans will not give in to any of them. Number one, that NATO withdraws its presence from Russia's western border. Number two, that NATO puts into writing that it will not expand into Ukraine, Moldova, or Georgia. And thirdly, that the Americans will dismantle their missile defense system or their missile shield in Eastern Europe. They are the three core Russian demands. And Trump and no one after him, his successor, if there's to be a successor next year, will not give in to any of those demands. So we are in now for an indefinite period of bitter tension between America and Russia.
I think it's fair to say we're rapidly running out of time, gentlemen, here, but I think we'll end on this very pessimistic note, is that I think U.S.-Russia relations have been spoiled for at least a generation, so I don't even think we have to look at incremental changes. All right, gentlemen, that's all the time we have here. Many thanks to my guests here in Moscow and in London, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.